Hello, everybody. Welcome to another podcast. I appreciate listening to the previous podcasts and, of course, comment on another podcast. That means a lot for the podcast. And, of course, for the podcast to grow, I need your feedback. If you have any comments or anything related to the podcast, anything you disagree with in the podcast, you can comment in Spotify or whatever platform you listen to podcasting. Okay? Before we dive in, let's define some keywords. Hierarchy. A system in which people or groups are ranked above others based on the status or authority. Examples: in many workplaces, the corporate hierarchy ensures the executives have more decision power than the employees. Systemic. Deeply embedded within and affecting an entire system rather than being an isolated issue. Example: systemic racism does not affect just individuals, but it is built into laws, politics, and institutions. Cognitive dissonance. It is the mental discomfort experienced when holding conflicting beliefs or values. It is the mental discomfort experienced when holding conflicting beliefs or values. Examples: a smoker who knows smoking causes cancer, but continues to smoke, experiencing this cognitive dissonance. Institutionalization. It is the process of embedding a practice or a norm within a society's laws, organization, or culture. Example: gender rules have been institutionalized for centuries, influencing expectations about men's and women's behavior. Oppression. The prolonged and unjust exercise of power over a group or individuals. Example: the history of colonial oppression left lasting economic and political challenges in many former colonies. Bias. A preference or inclination that prevents impartial judgment. Examples: news channels often show bias by reporting stories in a way that favors one political party over another. Fundamental attribution error. A psychological tendency to attribute others' actions to their character, while attributing our own to external circumstances. Examples: when Sarah was late, her coworker assumed she was irresponsible, but when she was late, he blamed the traffic, showing fundamental attribution error. Reinforce. To strengthen or support an idea, belief, or behavior. Examples: the constant praise from his teachers reinforced his belief that he was a talented student. Dissonance. A lack of harmony or agreement, especially between ideas or beliefs. Example: there was a noticeable dissonance between the company's public commitment to sustainability and its actual environmental practices. Remorse. A deep regret or guilt for wrongdoing. Example: the criminal showed no remorse for his actions, which influenced the judge's decisions to give a harsher sentence. Intervention. The act of stepping in to influence or change a situation, often forcefully. Example: military intervention in foreign conflicts is often justified as a peacekeeping effort. Exploitation. The unfair use of people or resources for one's own benefit. Example: the exploitation of factory workers in developing countries remain a major human rights issue. Transparency. Openness and honesty, especially in governance or decision-making. Example: the lack of transparency in political funding makes it difficult to know who is influencing politics. Disparity. A great difference in conditions, treatment, or opportunities between groups. Examples: the income disparity between the richest and the poorest citizens continues to widen. All right, that's it for the definitions. Try to repeat the podcast so that you can repeat these definitions. I know most of you, when you listen to podcasts, you're not really 100% focused. So what you can do is repeat the podcast and repeat these definitions so that they can you can remember them. Again, remember, it's the repetition, context, and use that you would remember these words. Today, we are diving deep into something we all encounter, but often struggle to pinpoint. It is double standards. Why do they exist? Who benefits from them? And what can thinkers teach us about their role in society? But before we dive in, let me ask you this. Have you ever seen someone get away with something others might be punished for? Ever wondered why the rules don't seem to apply equally? Well, today we're breaking it all down. So, what are double standards? Let's start with a simple definition. A double standard occurs when the same principle applied inconsistently, favoring one group while disadvantaging another. It's not just about hypocrisy, it is about power. Double standards aren't mistakes. They serve a function. They maintain hierarchies, justify privilege, and also manipulate perception. Consider this. A student turns in a late assignment and gets punished or penalized, while the professor postponing grades without consequences. Or in the workplace, an employee is reprimanded for being late, while a higher up consistently arrives late with no issues. These double standards aren't just unfair, they are systemic. So what can literature tell us about double standards? For George Orwell, he understood the power of language. He mentioned that it shapes reality. There is a quote from Animal Farms, a political satire or an allegory. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. This quote captures how those in power rewrite rules to their advantage. It's not just unfair, it is a deliberate tool of control. In 1984, Orwell introduced doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time. Take a real-world example. Countries that criticize dictatorships while supporting oppressive regimes when it serves their interests, or companies that claim to support environmental causes while dumping toxic waste. Governments and corporations use language to obscure double standards. They would use phrases like collateral damage instead of civilian deaths, or enhanced interrogation instead of torture. Orwell warned us about this. He said, if you control the language, you control the perception. Michel Foucault took this idea even further by looking at how power operates through institutions, laws, education, and social norms. In Discipline and Punish, he explores how punishments is applied differently based on social status. Let's look at modern policing. A wealthy person convinced of fraud might get probation, while someone in poverty gets years in prison for a non-violent crime. Or take the media. A protest in one country is framed as a fight for democracy, while a similar protest elsewhere is called violent unrest. What Foucault is trying to say here is that double standards are not just inconsistencies. They're deeply embedded in institutions to reinforce existing power structures. In the same light, Frantz Fanon, in The Richard of the Earth, examined how colonial powers justified oppression through double standards. Colonizers claimed to bring civilization while engaging in brutal exploration. Think about how countries justify military interventions. Think about how countries justify military interventions under the banner of peacekeeping, while condemning similar actions by others as aggression. Fanon argued that double standards create psychological conditioning, convincing the oppressed that their suffering is natural or deserved. A modern example of this is the way the global economy treats different nations. Developing countries are expected to follow strict economic policies, while powerful nations violate the same rules without any consequences. Psychologists also weighed in on this issue by studying cognitive biases that contribute to double standards. Leon Festinger, for example, introduced cognitive dissonance. It is a mental discomfort that we feel when holding contradictory beliefs. People resolve this conflict by justifying unfair treatment. Take an experiment by John Darley and Paget Grass. Participants were shown two videos of a young girl named Hannah. In one, she was from a wealthy background, in the other, from a lower income background. When asked to assess her academic ability, participants who saw the wealthy version rated her higher, even though both groups watched the same test footage. This reveals how societal biases create double standards. Another relevant concept to this is the fundamental attribution error. It basically is when we judge others harshly for their mistakes, but we excuse ourselves. For example, if someone else is late, we assume they're responsible. But if we're late, on the other hand, we blame traffic. This bias also fuels double standards in social judgments. But of course, not everybody agrees that double standards are real. Some argue that what we perceive as unfair treatment is often a result of context, not a bias. Jordan Peterson, for instance, argues that different outcomes in society are often due to personal choice and individual differences, not systemic injustice. Others suggest that people selectively notice double standards that disadvantage them while ignoring those that work in their favor. Some evolutionary psychologists argue that perceived double standards are often byproducts of social structures that evolve for efficiency rather than fairness. For example, different gender rules historically developed based on survival needs, not discrimination. There are also legal scholars who claim that laws that don't actually enforce double standards, but are just interpreted differently based on circumstance. A judge giving different sentences to two people who committed the same crime might be considered background, remorse, or risk to society, rather than applying an inconsistent rule. So, are double standards real? Or do we selectively apply this label when it suits us? This is something worth thinking about. Now, let's bring this into sharper focus with some everyday double standards. Freedom of speech. Celebrities or politicians can make controversial statements and get defended as expressing their opinion, but ordinary people lose their jobs for less. Gender expectations. A woman being assertive is seen as difficult, while a man doing the same is seen as strong-willed. Media coverage. A crime committed by a wealthy individual is a moment of poor judgment. The same crime committed by a lower-class person is seen as dangerous criminal behavior. Workplace behavior. Employees, for example, are expected to work long hours and stay productive, but CEOs can take long vacations with no repercussions. Parenting standards. A father who works late is seen as dedicated, but a mother who works late is seen as neglecting her children. Double standards shape how we perceive justice, morality, and success. And once we recognize them, only then we begin to challenge them. But what can we do as individuals? First, awareness. Recognizing double standards is the first step to dismantling them. Second, language. Be critical of the words used to justify unfairness. Orwell showed us that those in power control narratives, so we must question them. Third, accountability. Call out inconsistencies. Demand transparency in politics, media, and workplace. Fourth, psychological resistance. Be aware of psychological biases, like cognitive dissonance or attribution biases, within yourself. Challenge your own assumptions. Last, education. Educate yourself about social psychology, institutional power, and more to be better equipped whenever you want to have a conversation with someone. So double standards aren't just about unfairness. They shape our reality. Orwell, Foucault, Fanon, and modern psychology showed us that these contradictions are designed to reinforce power structures. But once we see them, we can resist them. That was it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time. Bye.